Welcome to Everyday Monsters, a weekly podcast that spotlights the short stories of the damaged minds that walk among us. Listen as each author hypnotizes you with stories of betrayal, carnal lust, greed, and the supernatural. Join your host, Donnie Lansdale, for a walk in the park. It won't be long. After all, they are short stories.
Greetings and thank you, Miss Angela, for that wonderful introduction. Donnie Lansdale here, your host, your guide to yet another short story on the Everyday Monsters podcast. Brought to you by our good friends and endorsed by the Writers Forum Facebook group. On Facebook, 77,000 members supporting authors and writers worldwide. And I have a story from England. That's right. The author, Nick Adigu Burke, was born in Manchester, England in 1979. Is English, Nigerian, and Irish descent. Nick's writing career began in 2013 when he entered a ghost story competition hosted by the University of Manchester. His spooky Victorian tale, The Last Killing Field, scooped first prize, and he has never looked back. From a very young age, Nick has been drawn to all things supernatural, with his debut novel Satan's Fall, released in October of 2017. He brings us a wonderful short story about demonic possession. This one is called Diagnosis Demon on Everyday Monsters, the podcast. Enjoy. Diagnosis Demon. In all my years in demonology, never have I encountered a demonic possession of such brutality as the Emil Ritchie case. The events of which I refer occurred 30 years prior, but when I close my eyes and I see the anguish contorted on Emil's choirboy face, I still weep. Emil was just a child of 14 when I tended him at his grandparents' farm on the edge of the Pinaise. Barely a teenager and broken by his blighted life, and of course, Antion, the demon that tortured him from within. By the time I'd arrived at Homestead, his grandparents' farm, I'd helped hundreds with their demons. Demons that fall into one of two categories. First, the psyche demon. Entities who possess the human mind and body by metaphorical entering it via wounds to the psyche. Wounds may be through residual pain brought on by past trauma or reactive pain brought on by ongoing trauma. The second species, the house demon, unlike the psyche demon, is powerless to infiltrate the mind and can only inflict their terror from outside the body, typically possessing houses, slamming doors, breaking ornaments, and physically attacking their victims. Emil Ritchie's demon was of the psyche order. I entered demonology through psychiatry, gaining my Ph.D. in 1984, and taking my first practitioner's role at Stepping Hill Hospital weeks later. During my tenure at Stepping Hill, I saw numerous schizophrenia patients. In some, I discovered strange but reoccurring themes, themes unassociated with the condition. For example, patients speaking in alien tongues or relaying secret knowledge. I was certain these unusual side effects were indicative of something other than schizophrenia. Amidst these revelations, Father Richard Hastings, the hospital chaplain, visited me. One of his parishioners had contacted him after their teenage daughter, Julia, had been possessed by a demon named Arua. Father Hastings knew I was open-minded and asked me to rule whether Julia's affliction was due to mental disorder or demonic possession. After some persuading, I agreed to see Julia, but on the proviso I could only diagnose mental illness and not demonic possession. Well, if I wasn't convinced of Julia's demonic possession by her impressive knowledge of the Latin and French vernaculars, or by her superhuman strength, or her recitation of John Milton's Paradise Lost, then I was convinced when she levitated to the ceiling and her head snapped back. Julia's incident changed my life. Thereafter, I worked intimately with Father Hastings, part-time, consulting over his prospective demonic possession cases. Eventually, I became a full-time demonologist. I arrived at Homestead upon the rain-drenched moors on the morning of October 26th. The first thing I noticed about the old farmhouse was that the curtains were drawn. Strange. On the door hung a huge crucifix, and when I knocked, Emil's grandparents both greeted me. For every demonic possession case, I usually had a dossier, 3 inches thick, full of family history. But such was the family's desperation, there wasn't time for my usual pre-diagnostic work. I did, however, have the ages of the grandparents, with Frank Gilmartin being 63 and his wife Georgina being 62. However, their stress made them appear closer to their 80s than their 60s. I entered the farmhouse by crossing a border of salt. Frank and Georgina both dressed as though they prepared for a snowstorm. The house was freezing and so dark that it resembled more of a grotto than a home. In the gloom, they led me up a creaking set of stairs to the back bedroom. The door, crucifix too, was bolted shut, and the grandfather stopped me to place the long key into my hand. Then, fretfully said, "The lady I spoke to—" "Ah, Miss Harris, my secretary," I interjected. "She said this was confidential. Do I have your word that it is confidential?" "Everything we discuss, and everything I discover here today, remains within these walls," I replied. "You have my word." Emil's bedroom was dark and colder still, and emitted a mustiness that stole my breath. Naturally, I moved to turn on the light, but the grandmother lunged at me, screaming, "No!" I stepped back and looked to Mr. Gilmartin for answers, and he looked at Mrs. Gilmartin for reassurance. Then she explained. "The demon comes from Emil's shadow." "His what?" I replied, thinking I'd misheard. "His shadow. The demon possesses Emil's shadow. He controls it and makes Emil do things." "What things?" "The most heinous things," she sobbed. "The demon possesses Emil's shadow. Nonsensical. Yes, demons possess houses, and sometimes bodies, but never shadows. Such an alien concept that I just nodded and approached the bed. In the gloom, I made out the shape of Emo, who seemed not to notice me as he wearily perched on the bed's edge. "I brought someone to see you, Emo," his grandfather said. "He'll help us. Help you." "You can help, can't you?" the grandmother whimpered. "Yes, of course." I smiled, although I still had to rule out mental illness. Despite Emil being made aware of my presence, he still hadn't turned around. Mr. Gilmartin fetched me a chair, and I politely asked him and his wife to leave the room so I could begin my diagnostic work uninterrupted. I asked Emil if Antimon, the demon, was there, to which he shakably replied, "No." I then asked Antonin if it was there. At this point, if a demon is present, anger would explode from it and be unable to remain elusive. The boy silenced, and I wasn't attacked, so Antimon's absence was confirmed. Given the boy's days, I wasn't confident he'd talk. I asked him to tell me his history. Surprisingly, he was extremely lucid about his experiences. The following, for the purpose of this recount, are extracts transcribed from a much lengthier conversation, some of which was interpreted by the boy's own emotional breakdowns. Email began. My first memory is the orphanage. I was called Nicholas back then. Mother Superior was angry, and the other kids must have thought it funny because I heard them laughing. I couldn't say my name. The nuns called me lazy, said I'd a lazy tongue. But I wasn't lazy. I'd had a stroke at birth, that's all. Just unlucky. I didn't really understand what happened. People tried to explain, but they'd talk too fast and weren't clear. But Dr. Reynolds, she gets it. She knows how to talk to me. She said the fact I was born without eyes. Emil then paused and twisted to face me. In the scarce room light, I saw empty caverns where his eyes should have been. You sound shocked. I can hear it in your breath, he said, then turned his face to the wall again. I had no eyes, so my other senses overloaded and increased my blood pressure too high, and I had a stroke. My dad abandoned us after a week, and although my birth mom kept me for 2 years, she also couldn't cope with the blind baby and dumped me at the orphanage. I spent 9 years in St. Cuthbert's near Halifax. I remember the smell, reek, but even more I remember the crying in the night, all night. You could hear them, the other kids. They were really frightened. The dark does that. But at least their darkness wasn't permanent. That place was run by nuns, and they were evil. They'd split the orphanage into 2 wings. The larger wing was where they put the normal kids. I was in the other wing, the smaller one, where the devil children stayed. Devil children is what the nuns called us. They were childless and heartless, and beat us so often that we thought we deserved it. After all, I was a bedwetter. And every time I sinned, they refused to change my bedding. And during winter, I'd spend weeks stinking of piss. Some days, Mother Superior would come to our dorm with 2 other nuns and gather a few of us together. We'd be marched to the bathroom to be scrubbed and made presentable. They'd dress us in clothes, still warm and stinking of bleach. These were the days we'd be viewed by potential adoptive parents. The viewings were rare, though. I mean, there's less demand for damaged children. That's what we thought, anyway. After they cleaned us, they'd warn us, don't be devils. Then, like cattle, they'd walk us in front of our possible matches. Initially, it excited me, gave me hope, but soon it hurt. I'd lost count after the 20th rejection. I hated the whole silly circus. I felt so worthless. But more, I hated the silence. Whenever they'd see me, I could feel them staring, even feel their expressions, half disgust, half disbelief, staring at the boy without eyes. For 9 years, I wished I'd died at birth, feeling so worthless that even the beating stopped hurting. Then, just before my 11th birthday, I was paraded, and there was no awkward silence, nothing but happiness in the voices of the visitors. And in that happiness, I could see their faces, kind and smiling. Finally, I hadn't been rejected. I was so excited, I couldn't imagine how my life was going to change. My new parents, Ruth and Paul Ritchie, were amazing. They changed my name from Nicholas to Emil, which I preferred. Gave me a new start. I then asked Emil to describe the night the demon first attacked him. It happened when I turned 13. Couldn't sleep. I was angry. I felt abandoned again. They were forcing me to change schools. I was settled at St. Mark's, but St. Mark's didn't want me, said I needed specialist help. As I twisted in bed, someone whispered my name, not Emil, but Nicholas. The voice was all wheezy, like an old man dying. I was scared and fell from the bed crying. Mum and Dad must have heard because they came to me. Dad's voice was annoyed. Thought I was misbehaving because I didn't want to change schools. My mum cuddled me and told me it was a dream. I knew it wasn't, though. I was awake. The following nights were quiet. It was half-term, and I still hoped St. Mark's would reconsider. But by the weekend it was clear I was going to the new school, which scared me. I was struggling to sleep when the voice whispered my name again. Horrible and wheezy. My chest ached, and I stumbled from my bed to the closet. I opened the door and hid, shaking, praying for a life I hated. The closet door thumped, then started to tremble. I prayed even harder. The demon was in the closet with me. Like ice, I felt the coldness of its body press me and felt its breath on my ear. I smelt blood, too. How blood tastes, but as a smell. It repeated my old name, Nicholas. Over and over. When I covered my ears, I still heard it. It said some other things too, but I can't remember. My heart was beating so fast, but I think this is when it called itself Antioch, but I'm unsure. I wanted to scream, but I was too scared. I was trapped between it and the closet wall. It told me nobody would believe me, growling, "Attention, seeker!" I put my head in my arms and knew it wasn't going to stop. I began to cry. "What do you want?" And it said, "Friend, cure pain." It then silenced. That's when my neck went stiff, and I couldn't move my head. I felt freezing hands strangling me, yet I could still breathe. Next, my whole face numbed, and I heard buzzing in my head like a fly was trapped inside. I became dizzy and thought I would puke. The top of my brain began to itch. It was weird, but I imagined a worm burrowing into it. That's what the demon was doing. Burrowing. My head ached like brain freeze, after which my whole body ached too, and I wanted to leave the closet. I left and strangely fumbled to turn on my lamp. "Excellent," Entenmann said, with a voice that was now inside my head. "He who controls the shadow controls the man," he confusingly added. Then he laughed as I collapsed to the floor. I could hear Anton much clearer. Said my pain would end if I killed my parents. "No," I cried. "Trust me," he said. "Friends, trust." I said no again, thinking he would become angry, but he laughed and said, "As you wish." Still on the floor, the numbness went, but I felt I was being twisted inside out. I was now paralyzed, yet felt my body move. It made no sense. I was moving, but without control, and when I tried to gain control, nothing happened. I blacked out, because I was not in my bedroom but the bathroom. I could feel the cold tiles on my bare feet and the buzz from the overhead light. I still didn't have control of myself. Antian repeated, "He who controls the shadow controls the man." I felt the metal cold in my hand, but not knowing what I was holding. I guessed my mom's hairdressing scissors, but wasn't certain. I blacked out again. When I recovered, I could hear my parents snoring, which they always did, whenever they'd been drinking. The smell of wine hung over them. I shuffled to the bed, though I didn't want to. My hand, holding the scissors, lifted above my head and came down really fast. I was growling like a dog, while continuously hitting Dad's chest with the scissors. I felt a hard, then soft feeling with every quick strike, and my hand became warm and wet. Uncontrollable, I moved to the other side of the bed. There, my hand lifted above my head, and I struck down at my sleeping Mum. I felt a hard, then soft feeling, but Mum started screaming. She pushed me. "What have you done? What have you done?" She wouldn't stop screaming and pushing. "Emil, you've killed him," were the words that made me realize I had murdered my dad. I collapsed, my entire body stinging. I regained my senses, but my dad was still dead, and my mother is still in a coma. Emil silenced, and I slumped in my chair. Obviously, I had little previous knowledge of Emil's possession, other than he'd committed unspeakable acts under demonic influence. Emil's revelations placed greater emphasis on my diagnosis. It now wasn't just a possible demonic possession case, but a possible murder case, depending on my findings. However, I could only feasibly draw one conclusion: demonic possession. But how did Antion possess Emil's shadow? If indeed that's what transpired, first, I needed to understand why the Gilmartins had plunged their farmhouse into darkness, although I had my inkling. They confirmed that they were scared of the shadows, which light produces, in particular, Emil's shadow, the shadow Antion hijacked for murderous gain. Upon my request, the Gilmartins escorted me to the dull, cold kitchen, and apart from the rain drumming its monotony on the window, it gave me a place to digest Emil's grave revelations. I opened my mind to every possibility, and after great contemplation, I had plausible theory to why Emil Demon was able to infiltrate his physical shadow. Antonin was undoubtedly a psychic demon. Therefore, in my theory, I personified Emil's psyche as the motivator of his actions. I pictured it as a miniature replica of himself, dwelling in the darkness of his subconscious mind, gorging on the memories housed there. I then imagined his psyche moving into the light of the conscious mind, and just as the body casts a shadow in sunlight, it cast a shadow there. However, the memories Emil's psyche gorged upon were large and traumatic, allowing his psyche to grow monstrous, creating a shadow of equal proportion. This shadow darkened the entirety of his mind. Therefore, the boy's physical actions were near exclusively being ruled by his traumatic experiences. For example, take the man who, throughout life, has endured nothing but hate. In theory, his actions can only be motivated by hate, as he knows nothing but hate. Here there becomes little distinction between his inner shadow, how he thinks, and his outer shadow, how he behaves, leaving no room for second thoughts, therefore allowing the demon to leap between and possess the two shadow states. In his own words, Antion said, "He who controls the shadow controls the man." And that's what transpired. It took advantage of Emil's unceasing inner darkness and used it as a platform to leap into the outer darkness of his physical shadow and commit murder. Now it was time to banish Antion. I explained to the boy and his grandparents that I would bind him to the bed for his and our own safety. However, we'd have to await sunset before beginning the cleansing, explaining that complete darkness was required to stop the demon from jumping back and forth between the boy's inner and outer shadows, and so evading exorcism. In darkness, wearing my night vision goggles, I began in Latin. Antium, perdi monem te voco. Antium, in God's name I summon thee. A statement that should have roused the demon. However, it remained absent. No palpable power ruling the dark. No foul stench, no growling, low or otherwise, nothing. Antion, perdi novium te voco. Antion, in God's name, I summon thee, I repeated, while using the aspergillium, the holy water sprinkler Father Hastings had provided. Instantly, the most terrible stench invaded the bedroom, as though the sewers had ripped open. The aspergillium in my hand flew across the room and clanged against the door. He's here, I said to Gilmartins. Stay strong. Antoine slithered into Emil's body, and the boy growled and shook and fought like a cornered lion, roaring to escape his bindings. The bed trembled and jumped into the tumultuous fight, and the screaming Gilmartins humanized the demonic cacophony. Demon, relinc corpus hoc, quod pedis ut dorum. Demon, leave this body you claim as yours, I called above the din. The boy ceased fighting, and the room silenced. Then, contorted by the demon, Emil growled, "Fuck you!" and the fight erupted again. For hours we prayed, and repeated hundreds of Latin verses, and for hours besieged in a ferocious confrontation of sweat and spit, Emil battled, with claret oozing from his bindings. More hours elapsed, embroiled in the most horrific fight. Antonin was a belligerent foe. I was exhausted. The Gilmartins were exhausted. Emil was exhausted. But Antium was as powerful as it had been when it first possessed Emil. Soon, I realized morning's slow creep would begin, and even the tiniest chink of sunlight could see Antonin leaping into Emil's physical shadow, proving a platform to destroy everyone in that room. We valiantly fought on, but my worst fears were unfolding. The sun was rising over the Pennays, and although the room's light was sparse, it created enough shadow for Antonin to make his leap. Emil screamed and convulsed as Antonin possessed his shadow. I became more frantic in my Latin recitals, my juddering tongue stumbling like a drunkard. Wide-eyed, we stared, near frozen, at Emil snapping from his bloodied bindings, while continually snarling and spitting obscenities. I retrieved the strewn aspergillum and swung it in Emil's direction, sprinkling him with holy water, attempting to buy time to escape the room. Antoine screamed like a snared fox, and the evil power enthroning the room loosened its rule. Darkness lunged free of the boy, as though a shadow flung from a flashed torch. Emil fell onto the bed, and his freed shadow was crawling like a panther, dying, slithering for the windows, screeching the most horrific screech. Again, I swung the aspergillum in the shadow's direction, and from the water which settled upon its darkness, threads of smoke rose as wispy gray vipers. They all intertwined, forming a larger, smokier viper, which reared in Bennett's form before striking to consume the screeching shadow. By fluke, Antonym was gone. The power it wielded to control Emil's shadow became its ultimate weakness. A body is always stronger than its shadow, and so dousing Emil's shadow with holy water, while Antonym was possessed within it, weakened Antonym's resolve. Ordinarily, holy water only aggravates demons, but in Emil's case, it proved enough.